In a recent piece for Blaze News, FBI whistleblower Steve Friend wrote about the July 13th assassination attempt on Donald Trump, and he has an idea of what could have caused the Secret Service massive security failures. Here to break it all down is Matthew Peterson, editor-in-chief of Blaze News, and Steve Friend, who also co-hosts The Morning Post. So, Steve, thanks so much for joining us today. So, what institutional changes led to the biggest Secret Service blunder in decades?
Well, among many, I would attribute a large share of it to the 30 by 30 initiative that is taking and infecting law enforcement around the country by storm. And this is an initiative to get 30% female participation in law enforcement actually into leadership by the year 2030. And what we've had is the Department of Justice and Department of Homeland Security sign on to that initiative. And the problem is anytime that you prioritize immutable characteristics like the race of the person or the genitalia wagging between their legs over the quality of the candidate, by definition, your product will suffer. And we saw no greater failures there than on July 13th, when you had a couple of members of the protection detail who couldn't even holster their firearms there. So led me to go down a rabbit trail and look more into the 30 by 30 initiative, which I'd only seen some bared bones details of. And what I saw was pretty stark and concerning for me.
Steve, it sounds like what you're describing, I mean, this is a much larger problem. I mean, this is a national problem. That's what you're saying, right? That is affecting law enforcement throughout the nation.
It absolutely is. And even if you're not willing to sign on to it, the Biden-Harris DOJ will go after you for it. We recently saw that the DOJ is going after the city of South Bend, Indiana's police department for not essentially complying with this. So my question is, was Mayor Pete aware of it? Because apparently they're not going by the rubric of following that we have to have physical fitness tests that don't actually test your physical fitness. We have to have job knowledge tests that don't actually test your knowledge of the job, because apparently by the 30 by 30 initiative, those are discriminatory against females and minority candidates. And then there's also the cultural aspect to it, where the 30 by 30 initiative says things like you're homophobic or white culture when you're having qualities like valuing adherence to English common law or politeness or having a rigid time schedule, all things that are really paramount for a proper and effective law enforcement agency.
Well, we know that crime is all over the country right now, and Donald Trump was actually fact-checked for saying that crime is much worse than what the government admits. And there was a recent piece on Blaze News that revealed that the government actually changed, the FBI changed its crime statistics from 2022. They say it fell by 2.1%, but it actually went up by 4.5%. So how much of this data is the Bureau withholding? And I mean, what do you make of a story when you see the numbers are so egregious like this?
There's lies, damn lies, and FBI crime statistics at this point because they use them one way or another to their best political advantage. They're not a law enforcement agency anymore. They're a secret police force, and they're a politicized, weaponized agency. So as it comes to this, they aggregate by statute. They're supposed to aggregate all the crime stats around the country so they can present them to the American people. But 30 to 31% of police departments around the country were not reporting to the FBI, and that included departments from Baltimore, Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, these hotbeds of high crime rates. And the FBI was just sort of putting its finger in the air and guessing what it projected were those rates because they were politically convenient. Now, the local municipalities, the mayors, those police chiefs, they benefited by not reporting it because they aren't held accountable because crime is through the roof. And then the FBI took those stats that they made up at a whole cloth and brought them to the Biden-Harris administration. And then they was used for a fact check against Donald Trump when we all know that crime is through the roof. And they do the exact opposite when it comes to terrorism. This was what I blew a whistle about. The FBI takes terrorism stats and either entraps individuals or does what they did with January 6th and creates hundreds and thousands of cases out of one particular incident because they want to juke those stats upwards. These stats mean nothing. They're just political narrative.
Steve, you speaking of entrapment, you uncovered another entrapment case this week, I believe. Can you tell us about that?
This is one of the most egregious ones that I've ever seen, and I've been looking at this for the last couple of years. The FBI essentially facilitated a young man at the age of 19 and groomed him, and arguably might have been looking at him before he actually reached the age of 18, and groomed him to go and join the Army. Now, my question then is, did they withhold the fact that they were assessing him before he went through that? Or did they actually collude with the DOD to get him into the Army ranks so that then they could, across 6 fiscal years, keep an ISIS case open on him and then eventually entrap him and arrest him for providing material support to terrorism? And the issue here that really struck me was he was looking at ISIS at the age of 19 in 2019 because he's a young man. He doesn't know that ISIS was after the Trump administration put a kibosh on that in early 2017. So that to me indicates that he is actually a vulnerable person. And instead of sending somebody out to him and actually poking him and saying, hey, look, you're headed down a dark path. They're a mandatory first reporter. If he's emotionally disturbed, they have to bring that forward. But just say, look, I'm a consequence of that. But they didn't do that. The FBI now views American people as a target, as an opportunity, and they facilitated him joining the military so that they could then bring these charges against him. And never for a second thinking that, well, this guy's going to have access to live ammunition. He's going to be on a firing line during boot camp and during extensive other training. Maybe he's going to shoot another American soldier because he's just not with it. This is egregious, and it's just another example, very much like the way that they facilitated that arrival of that Pakistani across the border and let him operate within the interior. This trend is growing and it's getting out of control. It's putting innocent people at risk.
Well, Steve, that's my next question for you, because you uncover this case. You mention the Iranian that they brought across the border. How widespread are these entrapment cases, if not currently with the FBI, but you say it's going to be growing? How worried should Americans be about these cases?
Well, historically, they are out of control. I mean, you can go back 10 years, 2014, Project Salam, which comes from the political left, did an assessment of 400 FBI terrorism investigations and found that 396 of them, 99%, involved an individual who was not predisposed to engage in a terrorist act, not capable, wasn't able to, but for the involvement of the FBI. So they have a long track record of engaging on this. It's just that the target of it is different. They're always happy to go and get that ISIS case or Al-Qaeda case, but really they're going after their new prime target. That's the domestic violent extremist or the anti-government, anti-authority violent extremist, the agave who, by the definition of the FBI, is someone who has just a perception of government overreach or negligence, which I can think of 56 men who signed a Declaration of Independence who would find themselves in the crosshairs of an FBI domestic terrorism investigation today.
Steve, we're going to break it down a little bit later in the show, but I have to get your take on the Bret Baier interview with Kamala Harris last night while we have you here.
Well, I wish that he had those crime stats there to fact check her on it, but it clearly did not go well for the vice president. I was relieved to see finally a member of the journalist crew hold someone's feet to the fire, continue to stay over the target with her on it. And she flubbed because she's a word salad production machine, and it was there for the American people to see. And the only question is how much the Trump campaign is going to exploit that, because I think they should just take 30-second clips and snippets and put, I'm Donald Trump and I approve this message, and blast across the state of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, she did a lot of the hard work for the Trump campaign last night, that's for sure. Steve, thanks so much for joining us.